We are on. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. This is Kubernetes SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. Today is the beginning of a new season in all the hemispheres. The fall for the Northern Hemisphere, the spring for the Southern Hemisphere. So times of changes. Thank you everybody for coming. We have a couple of topics from lavalamp into the agenda today. So I would say let's get to them and start. So Daniel.
Sure. Let's see. I think the first one, well, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if it's controversial or not. Basically, if you look at this PR, the goal here is to add a, and the authors called it a assume cache, basically to add it to client Go. What this thing seems to do is when you make a write to API server, the goal is to take that value that you wrote and store it in the cache so that if somebody else gets something out of the cache, then they observe the written object instead of like the thing that was there before the written object. So the tricky thing, of course, is like, what if other watch events are coming in the meantime? How do you know if the thing that you wrote is more recent than the thing that you have in the cache or not? And also, conversely, if you get a watch event, how do you know whether the watch event was before or after the thing that you wrote and have stored in the cache? Is that clear description?
I think that's
clear enough to me.
3/4 of the problem.
Okay, what did I miss?
There is currently per resource an ordering for our listers that says
right.
Another object was updated. Before this object was updated, you will always see a consistent order. The state that you see in the lister will have actually existed on the cluster. But if you record your update early, you can end up in a state where, say, a route object has already claimed a host name, but another object was updated in the middle that when you do a list across all these objects, you don't see the current value of.
Yeah, to put it another way, what I just described is fine if you're only looking at individual objects, but if you're looking at combinations of objects, once you do this, you have put things into your cache in an order in which they haven't appeared in the server. And if you compare two objects, one of which you've written to and one of which you haven't, we can probably come up with some sort of guarantee, but it may not be the one that people expect.
You mean objects of the same type or kind?
Correct. That's the only guarantee you have today.
Yes.
Objects of different kinds, you do not have a guarantee of ordering, but at a single kind, you do.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Yes.
So, I mean, that doesn't make the approach, that doesn't make it an impossible problem to solve. Is that your prop, Jordan? That doesn't make it impossible to solve, but it does mean that you would like for example, you could just lock everything until you observe the write, the watch event corresponding to your write. That solves the problem and maintains the property that David is talking about at the cost of like locking the entire cache for all consumers for a long time.
Whoa, slow down. The client is never guaranteed, as far as I understand, to see exactly that write. They're guaranteed to see that
so
right,
now you get to the
one.
Yes, now you get to the problem for why I have put this on the agenda. It's because there's actually no way to do this at all on in our system, because you can't compare. You're not supposed to compare resource versions, right? And you're not guaranteed to see an exact change. So how do you know if a watch event is older or newer than the thing that is in your cache right now? So I can, like, I think it's actually not possible today, and I can think of two ways of making it possible. The first way is to relax our constraint on not letting clients parse the resource version. If we let clients parse the resource version, which in fact clients do anyway, even though we tell them not to, then you could compare resource versions to see if something is older or newer, and solve the problem that way. The other solution I can think of is we could add a logical clock like the generation logical clock, but make it count the entire object, not just the spec.
Well, actually, now that you mention it, right, in a lot of cases, it's the spec is what we're concerned about.
In a lot of cases, actually, the controllers are actually more concerned with seeing their own changes, and the controllers often make changes in status.
Right. But at least in the controllers I've written, the cases where I need to kind of do this kind of thing of keep concerned about seeing my own change. Well, I guess it's true for status too. I need to know.
Yeah, at least for this author. I don't know if he has joined the call. Probably not. I don't see him on the list.
I think
at least for this author, that wasn't going to work.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand that. I mean, I'll admit I've struggled with this too, and I've, not solved it by comparing by parsing the resource version. I've not solved it by putting in this kind of a cache. But for status, right, for a status that a controller is providing, I think it's valid that the controller can just say, hey, if I did a successful write, I know it went there. I don't need to, worry about it. I mean, the controller.
It depends on your use case. Like if you're looking at the current state of the object to decide if you need to do a thing, and somehow it comes to your attention again in your cache, you could like double actuate or not actuate.
But I wouldn't be looking at the status of the object I'm implemented in order to decide if I have to do a thing.
That really depends on how your controller is written and what it does, right? Like you're not stating an invariant that works for all controllers. I totally believe that your controllers you can do this for, but not everybody writes things that way. Now, maybe they should, but we can't force them to.
Well, maybe this is another reason why they should.
I can imagine. I mean, I've dealt with many cases where you have a lot of different writers and they care about seeing the changes. I think I'd probably be willing to say at this point, it's been 8 years. It's an integer resource version.
Well, we do still have work percolating around the edges that maybe it doesn't need, maybe we don't want it to be a 64-bit integer. I'd be up for something a little more abstract. We provide an abstraction that can compare for, ordering without revealing exactly that it's an integer.
Yeah, when I was pre-discussing this with David, one of the things I thought about was because maybe if we let people compare for single resources, we should actually make it difficult to compare across resources. The easiest way I thought of doing that is just to put set a few bits at the most significant side of the N64, so that it's different for different collections, which would make it very difficult to compare without a lot more processing. So that, like, if we want to relax our constraint and say, okay, you can do some comparison, maybe at the same time we can be like, but we're going to make it actually difficult to compare across resource versions where across collections.
Well, again,
is actually kind of a hard boundary in the system.
If you make it an arbitrary length integer, then it's really just a string of a different kind almost. If you keep it a 64-bit integer, now you're cutting into the 64 bits. Yes. Let me remind you, I don't know if Steve ever presented his work here, but Steve Kusnewitz's work on the storing direct to cockroach, he pretty much needs all 64 of those bits. They're kind of precious, and he would rather have more bits, but he can kind of get away with squeezing it into 64 bits. But I wouldn't ask it to be squeezed into any fewer.
We're currently an integer, so we have infinite bits, or sorry, a string, so we have infinite bits.
Well, no, because clients actually parse it as a signed 64-bit int. So in fact, Steve has squeezed it into 63 bits. And we would break stuff if it were anything other than a, you know, a signed 64-bit positive integer.
Right. That's the issue, is that clients actually, in fact, parse this today. That's why we should have made that much more difficult in the past. And I attempted it, but we were already too big at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on the next question I was going to ask is, you know, could we do a transition where we introduce an abstraction to use instead of parsing, and then at some point we change the strings that appear so that the abstraction keeps working, because of course we've shipped an implementation that will keep working, but the strings that will break clients that are not using the abstraction.
The difficulty is, like, how do you get people from all different languages to use the same? Like, if you are going to solve this with code, like, you got to implement this in every client library. If you're going to solve this with an additional field, that could maybe be okay, where like resource version just holds the lower 63 bits, and this other field has all the higher bits. That's maybe something that could be done.
Yeah, I don't think it's practical to create an abstraction that's going to work on a Java client and a JavaScript client unless we actually went and created it. If everyone is already convinced that people parse the string field as an int, then it seems non-contentious to say, all right, it's an int now, compare away.
Yeah, I mean, we do supply
if we
clients.
need more bits, then the practical thing to do is to add a additional field.
Or retire.
We do supply clients in a variety.
In a single etcd database, I don't think you're ever going to use up to 63 bits. But yes, if you're doing something more complicated. Sorry, Mike, you were saying?
I was just saying we do supply a lot of client libraries.
We do supply client libraries. However, most of the client libraries have most of their code automatically generated from our API schemas.
Also, the client libraries we provide then get used by programming languages, which will pull out those string fields and parse them. Like the client libraries we provide aren't doing parsing today. So the parsing is being done by other people's code built on top of those libraries. And experience updating the client Go token refresh stuff in 1.14 timeframe has shown you can wait years and you won't get adoption of new versions of client libraries in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a practical problem, right? So now there's stuff going on in the chat, right? The problem with string ordering is it's not consistent with the integer ordering we have now, right? If we could somehow switch to string ordering, that would be much more powerful than 63-bit integers. That would be a great solution, but we've just been talking about why we can't.
I mean, yeah, just extending the radix it seems painful, and 64-bit integers are big enough it should be big enough for anyone. Well,
that depends on what you're doing, right? So I've contemplated going to, sharding the storage. So yeah, and that would involve putting a version vector here. And that's not going to fit nicely in a 63-bit integer.
But it also would cause problems when you try to get these clients that have built around it to use it. So,
well, that's the problem we're talking about.
So we've discussed what if people use resource version as an int aspect, but what do people think of the other alternative, which is add a thing that is actually an int that is a logical clock for changes to the particular object?
So basically you're saying take the generation idea, but make another one that applies to the whole object.
Correct.
I think that would be a nice solution for a lot of things. Yes.
I don't feel strongly between that and just saying resource versions in int. So whichever.
Jordan, do you have a preference between those two?
It offends me philosophically to give up on saying don't parse, but I don't practically see how we would ever change it from what it is today. So if we can't ever change resource version from what it is today, we might as well get the benefit of being able to compare.
Yeah, I kind of, right. I agree with Jordan, right? I would like to see this to be an opaque string, ideally with wrapped into the abstraction we ship. But, you know, the conversation has just reiterated it's a 63-bit int. We can't change it from anything but a 63-bit int, right? And if we're going to insist that it's going to stay a 63-bit int, let's just admit that it's a 63-bit int.
What if we do both things?
Would you hold
Which two?
the cache, the assume cache PR on having the new thing? Or would you say, we've agreed that resource versions are integers, you can do this. Eventually, there might be a better thing for you to choose. But
well, I think we need to hold the assume cache PR on answering the thing that you brought up, which is like your list order is now undefined.
You won't be able to solve the list order problem with a single, with a per instance generation.
You can. You may have to wait extra.
What?
Why? How? I think you still need the resource version.
I mean, you're gonna see. Well, okay. So it depends on what.
Oh, actually. Oh, right.
What
Yes.
parsing
Okay.
you're using.
So to be clear, right, the suggestion was to use both. So if I understand correctly, the suggestion, one version of this is keep the resource version for bid parsing, add a whole object generation number. All right. And then in lists, there is no whole object generation number that makes sense. There's only a resource version. But a controller that is caring about this stuff, it knows, no, it's still not good enough. Yeah, so Daniel, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
I was suggesting, like, what if we both added a whole object generation and we let people parse resource version if they wanted to?
Yeah, if we let people parse it, what's the advantage of adding a whole object generation?
The advantage of having the whole object generation is that nobody's ever going to run out of bits.
Well, if we're concerned about running out of bits, that's the problem, even if we have a whole object generation.
I think whole object generation, if I'm understanding correctly, like we would need to bump it. We would basically be persisting a per object resource version, and we explicitly don't persist resource version in etcd today because it would make
it wouldn't increment with every change to every object in the collection, only every change to that specific object.
Right, but that would mean like the no op write. If I round trip and I'm not going to modify the object in any way, like it doesn't actually persist and update to etcd.
We'd have to make an exception for this field. If the only thing changing is this field, then it's not a real write, and we don't actually increment it.
It's congruent with what we do with generation, I think.
Right, I'm just thinking about practically like how we would implement it. Like today it's a byte comparison to say like the bytes we were going to put in etcd match the bytes that are already there. So
I think it's a little more complicated. Haven't we fixed the server-side apply no op write bug? I think it's much more complicated than a byte comparison at this point.
Mm-hmm. So even if you did have it, what could you do with it? If it hasn't changed, you would know, even though the resource version has gone up, that your object hasn't changed just by doing a comparison. That's one property that it would have a resourceless version doesn't have.
Yeah, I thought the whole point of introducing the whole object generation was to be able to continue to forbid parsing the resource version.
I don't know that I thought that far ahead. I'm just listing alternatives here.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to me if we allow parsing the resource version, then adding the whole object generation doesn't add anything.
It does add the ability to tell that you made a no-op write.
Okay, anything really significant? I mean, that seems like a really corner case.
I guess maybe you could actually already tell that from resource version not changing today.
Well, the resource version will change when anything changes in the system. So
Yeah. So if you do an update and the resource version doesn't change, you can already tell. Yeah.
We send back the
that's true.
global index, or do we send back the time at which the object was last written? I believe it's that.
The resource version of the persisted object.
Look, if you do a list and look at the resource versions of the items contained in the list, they're not all the same as the list resource version.
Correct.
Right, but that
So
wasn't the
for resource
question.
versions,
The
those-
point was that you could detect a no-op write by comparing the RV in the returned object with the RV, going into the write.
Oh, because yeah, if you saw the latest version of the object and your write made no effective change, then the resource version won't change.
Correct.
If you saw an old version and your write made no effective change from the latest version, then you would see the resource version of the latest version of that object.
I mean, you'd probably get a conflict because you were writing with the stale resource version, but
Unless you wanted exactly the thing that was already there.
No, that would still be a conflict, though, wouldn't it? I mean, if you, I think we're getting into really corner cases. I don't see the value in, we already live without this whole object generation today. We're hypothesizing really corner cases that could benefit from it. I'm just not convinced.
I mean, this corner case is like storage migration. It's important.
Yes,
Can
the
you
storage
explain that?
migrator is the one thing that needs to touch an object and make a write without actually changing anything about it.
Well, can you elaborate though?
The storage migrator triggers when there's been a storage version change on API server, or people should trigger the storage migrator, and it is supposed to read and then write the objects, causing the storage to become the new version and not the old version.
Right. And why would it care whether it was actually a no-op write?
Well, the problem is actually the other direction. Like our no-op write detection has broken the storage migrator in the past, because it's like, oh, you're not making a change. So I forget how we solved that. But I agree that we have strayed from the topic very far. Does anyone strongly object to telling people that they can parse resource version?
Not strong.
I think I was going to say my concern there would be is if you want to be fun and use cockroach and you want to play with that field. Yeah, you're not compatible maybe with the rest of the ecosystem, but if we start telling people that parsing is like really awesome.
Steve has got a way to right now, right? His code is already squeezing into those 63 bits.
But let's just say cockroach changes in some way that needs more bits, and
I agree, right? The problem is that the current state is it is a 64-bit, it is a 63-bit int, but you can't parse it, right? That's what was strongly emphasized in this meeting earlier, right? So the question is, one way of viewing what's happening is, the question is, do we change from it's a 63-bit int, but you can't parse it, to it's a 63-bit int and you can parse it?
I mean, effectively, it's not a change because today people actually, in fact, do parse it.
If we
gave them a,
if we wanted to frame it as you should use this as a big int, then like, yeah, people will still not read the docs just like they don't read the docs today. But in the normal case where you're working in etcd or you're working in a system that can fit within 63 bits, like the parsing works fine. And if any examples we give of parsing or comparing handle it as a big int, that at least starts to maybe shift the ecosystem towards, like, if you're gonna parse, do it this way. I don't know.
But if you have a dedicated field that only increments in the same way as generation, but for a whole object, and it is actually an int 63 or whatever, then you just tell people to use that field and there's no wrong way to use it. Right? Either the field exists because you have a new
Right.
API server.
But as someone said earlier, it will take years to get any kind of adoption. I mean, I'm sorry, it'll take years to get reasonably completed. I don't even know where's the right. Here's the question, right? There's this unbounded universe of code out there, right? We can make recommendations. We can expect most of it will change relatively soon, but that doesn't answer the question.
But isn't the goal to provide like a nice, safe API abstraction, whatever you want to call it, instead of trying to say, we oopsed and we should have hidden that field better, so just abuse it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, the issue for me is that there is literally no safe way to do this today without either breaking our rule or just like not being able to do it at all.
Well, the
so,
issue is
like,
breaking
if somebody
clients,
if
right?
somebody has the if somebody has the need and we've made it possible, then they'll be highly will be able to take advantage of that. So I think
right, this is a really basic project governance kind of question here. We have a change that we'd like to make, and we have this unbounded universe of clients, right? We can provide a path, a migration path for these clients, but we have no way of making sure that everybody actually does migrate. But as Daniel says, maybe it's enough to provide a reasonable path, a reasonable amount of time. Anybody that doesn't with that by that time.
I mean, nobody needs to migrate anything, right? People can't do this today.
But we're talking about, being nervous about saying that it's only 63 bits. Okay, we've been talking about alternatives to 63 bits. Maybe it's a big int. Maybe we have some other field that's strings lexicographically compared. We could take our existing ints and pad them out so that they lexicographically compare, right? So that it's actually both big int and lexicographic string at the same time. There's any number of things we could do, but any one of them, is not going to work for all clients that are out there today.
Okay, so let's wrap this up so we can go on to the next topic. I actually, Mike, I think you convinced me the opposite that you were intending. I think actually it's best to make a new field and make it a logical clock. And if people have this problem, they can look at that field. If they're currently parsing resource version, we're not changing anything about resource version, so we're not going to break them at all. But if people want, if in the future we do want to expand our use of resource version into something else and worry about breaking clients at that point, our hands aren't tied. So I guess I'll write that up and send an email to the SIG list, and we can.
For the sake of time, I'll not respond yet. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll say I think that adding a field like that is likely to need a KEP. That's pretty fundamental. That's every object out there.
Sure.
Adding a field. And I would like to see how it resolves the list problem. So
sure.
In that case.
Okay, well, at any rate, I think the next step is probably a write-up of the pros and cons of each approach. And we can have a more concrete discussion. Okay, the next question is on sub-resources versus fine-grained permissions. If you'll recall, 1 or 2 releases ago, we had a couple KEPs, one about liens and well, the one about liens has been in the system for a while, and we have not given the author a very expedient response. And the last time it went through, David was very worried about, I mean, not that he shouldn't be, but was worried about like permissions and how do you keep people from like wasting other people's resources, et cetera, by holding objects open forever, and wanted some way to cap the permissions. So then we latched onto the idea of maybe it needs a sub resource to expose this. And then the thinking was, well, finalizers doesn't have a sub-resource, or at least not a universal one. So maybe we should see if we can get a sub-resource for finalizers before we go making another thing. And then when I was reviewing that KEP, I realized that like if we're going to make a sub-resource for finalizers and a sub-resource for liens, and like we already know that people also would like a sub-resource for labels and annotations and maybe owner references and probably a couple of document I'm forgetting. But if we make all these sub-resources, we're going to put a client that is like, you know how we have the apply status and update status and put status, like we're going to, if we have like 6 final sub-resources, we're going to duplicate all those methods for everything, and then for every sub-resource, and then controller authors have to know which sub-resource to go to, and if they want to do multiple things, they got to make multiple calls, because they have to use the sub-resource, or people won't be able to configure their permissions correctly, and it just becomes a large mess, and I don't like it at all. So I wrote this document with a number of other approaches that I was hoping we could debate here. So I think Fede, if you could display the document, that might be a better thing for us. So I don't know if everybody had a chance to read this. I sent it to the list, I think, last week. I can go through the designs, or if people already know what they think, we can just open it up and people can talk. Would you like an introduction to each design?
Maybe jump the ones that are the most plausible. We've rejected a couple, I think, already.
Yeah, okay, so let's go to design 5. Let's go backwards, because I think 5 and 4 are the most plausible ones. Design 5 basically makes us a part of the CEL admission control effort, by making sure that if you write a policy, you can perform a secondary authz check, to see if there's an example on the screen right now, like either the labels match, or you have this permission, which would involve API server doing a secondary auth check, right? So it has some advantages. I think David isn't going to like this one because the cell admission is optional, and somebody could turn it off. Do you want to say why that's important to you, David?
Sure. I think it's important to have behavior around what authorization checks are made, not what the value of the authorization check is, right? If cluster admin wants to be always allow, fine. But which authorization checks are made, I would like to see be consistent across every Kube API server out there. And so I don't want this make this authorization check when these fields are changing. I don't want that to vary between clusters. Because if I go to cluster 1 and it checks one,
can you give us an example of like what goes wrong if those do vary?
Sure. So there is a GC admission plugin today that checks to see whether a user has permission to delete an object before setting an owner reference, and it is disableable today. And so some clusters you run on are protected. You cannot issue an update that results in a phantom delete, an escalation of the garbage collector to actually do a delete. And other clusters are not protected. So you got 2 classes of clusters, some where you're protected and some where you aren't. And it makes it difficult to know what state you're in. And I want to avoid that for a metadata field that exists everywhere.
Difficult for who? For controller authors, or for users, or for cluster administrators?
Yes.
I was just gonna give a quick little thing. Like the SRC recently had a vulnerability submission where someone was like, "Hey, I can delete stuff, and I shouldn't be able to." It was like, turn on the admission plugin, and then you won't be able to. But it's in our docs and everything, but like people don't know it exists.
So
I very much agree with what David is saying, which is if you have an authz check, it should always run.
Or be on by default. I think the issue we ran into with the garbage collection admission one was that it's off by default because it was added after the fact and we couldn't turn it on by default compatibly. So if we are strict by default, then when people are developing against a kind cluster or whatever, they're going to realize they need this permission. They're going to take that into account. They're going to write their controller, write their permissions in a way that accommodates it. If a particular cluster wants to like turn off protections,
So,
like okay, but
so is that the root?
Is
that the root of this? Is that the root of this concern? Like I develop on a cluster that doesn't have this thing enabled, and then I go to a cluster that does have it enabled, and my thing doesn't work, and my design is just completely wrong to make it work.
My concern is twofold. One, that most people don't realize it's a thing they need to consider and accommodate when they're planning and designing and developing. And then the other is what Mo mentioned, where it's like people don't have a protection and are vulnerable to this sort of cross actor interference. And the answer is, oh, did you not adjust from the defaults to protect yourself?
I guess I would also say that I would like to say that someone who opts out of this does it by making the authorization check always return allowed rather than disable the fact that someone checks.
Okay, let's see. Joe, you're on the call. What's the chance of making this CEL thing mandatory?
Oh, I mean, right now our main focus has been on the extensibility feature. So the idea of this being like a way to effectively add a first-party admission controller isn't on our list, and we haven't put a lot of thought into it. The first question I would have there is if you're going to do something that's standard, why not just write an admission controller for it?
And that would be option 4, right?
There is. I think that's actually option 3. Okay, well, why don't you scroll up, Fede, and let's look at another option here. Option 4. We can talk about option 3 first. Okay, so just to outline them, option 2 is like how you would build this thing to limit people to particular fields if your tools were webhooks and CRDs. And like obviously you can turn those off or fail to install them. Option 3 is what if we modified RBAC, which surprisingly you don't have to run RBAC, you can run other authorizables. So that also has this problem. Mo, I see your comment. Aren't all admission plugins disableable? Yes, they are, but that doesn't, like, we have the code. We could still run an admission plugin even if it's disabled, right? Like we could make a separate path for turning it on and off, and make sure that it's on by default. So that doesn't seem like a huge blocker to me. I think David disagrees with me, but
I think
but I'll argue that second.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe the framing is just wrong. Like for example, we do certain checks at the registry layer for RBAC and stuff, and you can't turn those off. I mean, I guess you turn the entire resource off, but you can't have the resource without the check. This would be a little weird because this would be like a registry check that every resource has, but maybe that's fine.
Possibly. I see the difference between modifying RBAC and creating a secondary authorization check as the RBAC change is more of a how you would get it done, but the secondary authorization check is what you would actually do. I've grabbed these two objects. I have the before, I have the after. I know what's changing, and now I need to check to see if that's allowed. And the only spot I can do that is either in admission or in storage. And then to check whether it's allowed, I can make an authorization check, and whether that is handled via some kind of RBAC rule or some kind of new authorizer, I could see creating a new type for it, or whether it's handled by a webhook, it would allow all that to function.
Yeah, I think if you can scroll to design 4, I think a new type is what I've proposed here. So basically, just to outline this, since it seems like this is going to be the winner, we do 2 checks. The first one, like, okay, so first, like, do you have edit at all? If you just have regular edit, then it does what it does today. If you don't have regular edit, then we check this some sort of per field permission, like should we go to the per field permission checking path? And if you have that, then there's something complicated to figure out which fields you've changed, which implies which permissions need to be checked. And you have to have some permission that covers each field that you're modifying. Hopefully that's not super confusing. Jordan.
I was just going to say, like, whatever we end up with, I think a good property is that the expression of the permissions can be done in a single place or in a coherent way. Like, one of the scary things that I see people having to do is sort of over grant permissions at the authorization level to say, why, yes, you can update nodes, and then separately put some sort of admission protection webhook or cell or whatever it is in
Yes.
place, but actually not really only this one field. So
I don't like that either, and that's why this one doesn't layer restrictions on people that already have an edit permission. You have to have a special permission. So it probably would be configured in 2 places. I think that's unavoidable, but at least the like permission that you have on the resource tells you, like, you need to go look at the per field permissions to see what this person can actually do.
yeah, the implementation has to be in 2 places, and we can, like, be diligent to make sure that I'm talking about more how you express that, like how you program that, not program, but how you how you declare that permission. Like, you say, I want them to have this, and then
we don't really have a choice. We're just going to do regular authz checks. So all we can, like, we've got the resource information and the verb and the subject. Is that the right word? And that's like all you can get out of and it gives you a yes or no, or a deny, allow, I don't know, triplet, right? That's all you can do for an authz check. So we gotta like shoehorn everything into that template. Which is kind of interesting.
Right, but we can do things like say we won't register that authorizer unless you also have the corresponding admission hook on. Like we can make it hard to, like,
so as written, this is not something that you would put in the authorizer chain. This is extra calls of the authorizer chain. So that would always happen.
I think you'd have to add an authorizer to the chain that allowed this to happen. I would rather not see the second check you make as an admission plugin. I'd rather see it in the same spot, but exist on rest storage, like be unturn offable.
It's been a while since I looked at that code, so maybe I'm using the wrong words. I thought our authorizer chain was a set of authorizers, which could fall through to the next one, but eventually you get a allow or deny answer, right?
Yeah, but the secondary check, right? It has to happen at the point in time that you have both the old object and the new object, and that is correct. In the, like, validate update method that gets passed to storage, as I recall.
Yeah, but why can't we call the ordinary authorization chain for that?
It could call the ordinary authorization chain, but I'm saying, instead of saying here's an admission plugin you can turn on or off, like, we could actually, that's what I'm saying. This is not a new emission plugin. This is like, the configuration doesn't go in an admission plugin, and the calls don't go into an existing admission plugin or a new one. They go into various places in the code. Okay.
At least that's how I'm thinking of it. Like, I could be making stuff up, but.
So I think one of the things Jordan said earlier isn't necessarily addressed in any, well, it could be addressed in any of these, but I think, Jordan, what you were asking for was a way to express the permission to do this conditional update without also granting regular update. And I believe you could do that if the authorizer chain was set up in a way to, like, I guess, like, tell storage that, hey, make sure when you're in validate update, I allowed this to get to you, but only under these specific conditions being true. So that makes sense.
So you're actually saying you want some sort of guarantee that if I give this person a, per field verb that they may do, they don't also have the regular update permission on the regular update.
Correct.
I mean, that's a problem our system has today, right? Like you can't give somebody namespace update and then like block them from a particular object and they disagree at different scopes.
Problem, right? Like fine-grained permissions. Like on the one hand, you might want to say like you can update deployments, but you can't set liens on deployments. Like because lien setting is like something I want to limit. So that's one way to frame it. The other way is, oh, you are a lien setter. I want you to be able to remove your lien from deployments, but I don't want you to be able to update like anything in deployments. That's crazy.
We can actually kind of turn it around. That might be an option, which is like, okay, forget about the initial thing and use negative permissions, which is option B there on the screen. So like you're only allowed to edit spec if you don't have the no spec permission.
I'm definitely a positive permission guy. I've gone through this path once before, and I could not write the code to express RBAC. In its very first iteration, RBAC actually had allow and deny. And after a day and a half, I couldn't make it work. So yeah, I'm positive permission only.
So I don't see how to address Jordan's
I think the positive permission would be you have the ability to set liens, and if you just had general update spec capability or update capability, you'd be able to set. I see. Okay, I finally got there. You want to not.
I want to know that
I care a lot more about the second story. As a lien setter, I only want someone to set liens. I don't feel as strongly.
Abdullah commented on the thread that you started, Daniel. Scheduler has a similar.
I looked at that. Yeah, I looked at that. Is it a KEP that he linked? And indeed, they have a field that they want basically the same thing for.
Yeah, they want to say like, until these things are true, this pod isn't really ready to be scheduled. And then they want to have like distributed actors saying like, yep, I made this thing happen. I made this thing happen. And only be able to set like their, yep, I'm schedulable now bit. And I'm trying to figure out how you would express that without doing that over granting, like, yep, you can edit anything in the pod and then somewhere else separately later say, but actually only this.
Well, the problem isn't the over granting. The problem is knowing that you haven't like given them edit somehow through some chain of RBAC or other configuration.
Like if you have a net new field, can you not make it so that it always requires the net new permission check for it to work? So like if you have update, it means you can update, but not that one field.
Right, but the issue is for them to send an update request to change that one field, you have to just give them like pod status update or pod update.
No, what I'm saying is now,
so they can change other fields in the pod.
No, I'm not saying we allow that. I'm saying that if you have both update and update lien, you can do anything you want. You can set liens and change the whole thing. If you have just update lien, you can only do update lien. If you just have update, you can update everything but lien or whatever the other fancy things are, right? Like but there's positive permissions. You can have them both together to do all the things you want. But
I'm missing how granting update lien like mechanically works to allow an update request, but scopes it to just updating that one field.
What I'm saying is we expand the code for authorization to inform storage that, hey, I let this through, but you need to make sure that bad things don't happen.
What is written here for option 4 is you get is almost exactly what Mo is saying, right? You do this check, the regular edit you don't get, then you do okay, do I get granular edit, some sort of granular edit? That comes back true. So you've done 2 authz checks. and you set something like in the context or something about something that goes with this request in API server that like, hey, you need to do the granular check later on. And then that goes through and it comes down to the storage layer and it sees the old object, the new object, and this bit that like, hey, you got to make sure that this change is authorized. And then it goes through and computes the different fields and computes which set of authorization checks it needs to do to let this in. But that still doesn't solve Jordan's question of like, how do I know if I've got this per field permission? How do I know that this person doesn't already also have the edit thing? But I think that's just a general fact of how RBAC or how our authorization system works. I don't know if I can fix that with this.
Yeah, so Mo, like to dig into that example just a tiny bit. So the first check we could, you come in with an update request and we say like, do you have update permission? And if you do, like, awesome, you can update whatever, like go through. And if you don't, then maybe we've got like 8 like labels, annotations, liens, finalizers, owner references, maybe like conditions, like I don't know what else. We've got like 6 fine-grained things, and so we have to check all 6 of those. And if you have any combination of those, we then let the request through and say you can update, but only if it's one of these like 3 things that you have permissions for.
That's not what's written in. That's not what's written in design 4. In design 4 is like there is a single permission for update everything. There's a single permission for do granular checks, and then in the storage layer, when we know the old and the new object, we compute which fields have changed, and we can search for authorizers, which like we can have a name for each field, like a programmatic name. And we can query authorizers to see if they have permission for that thing. So if you've changed 3 fields, it's 3 authz checks. I think there's
right, but they only happen when you're all the way past admission and everything, and you're just at storage, right? You initially might do 1 or maybe 2 checks, depending on the situation. But
I see. Okay.
While I'm not like ecstatic about the code complexity of any of this, I find that it'll probably be much easier to explain to someone that doesn't work on this code base with us, which is that this thing logically maps to this field, this singular check, and maybe you need this other marker permission to say that those singular checks have to go through or something. Maybe you can come up with a design that doesn't require that. But I still feel much better than saying, hey, give everybody update and try to cut it back with admission.
Yeah. All right. I think we're out of time. The plan is to hash this out again in next week's SIG auth meeting. So
I like, for the record, I like option 4, and I like 4 as a developer. I like 4A much better than I like 4B. And as a user, if somebody else will take care of it for me forever, I kind of want 4B as well.
Okay, so these are straw designs. So maybe we can write this. Like, obviously, this has to be a cap, and like, it's going to be a whole thing. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So David, I think you're next about the KEPs.
Yeah, I just want to make a 30-second. We have to add the KEPs that we're going to do for 126 before too long. So if you want your KEP included, bring it up on the mailing list, bring it up here. Actually, probably bring it up on the mailing list. And we can see about getting it added, make sure it gets review bandwidth and such.
Because the process has changed, right? For 126 now, it's different from.
There's an opt-in, yeah, and the opt-in is coming up in 3 weeks, I think.
Just to be clear here, are we talking about PRs that add and change KEPs, or are we talking about implementing KEPs?
We're choosing the set of KEPs we're trying to target at a release and which ones will graduate or not.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, enhancements freezes on the 6th of October. So you don't have much time if you want to change something.
So far I know of sell for admission for alpha, I think. And if Daniel wants to do something for sub-resources or fine-grained permission.
I don't have anything planned yet. Yeah, I was just trying to get an answer for this poor fellow.
All right. So we are for API parity and fairness trying to land this KEP change to add limits on the borrowing, and we are trying to get the implementation going. So can I again beg for some review on the KEP PR for adding the limits on the borrowing? And
Yes.
Abu, okay.
Yeah, chatted at me. I wasn't aware of that one. I did comment on the API one yesterday.
Thank you.
Let's see. All right, last topic.
Yeah, nothing. It's just me saying that KubeCon North America is coming. I'm not sure who is going, but we have a deep dive session for API Machinery. It has 2 topics. Thank you, David, for taking care of it. Jeffrey will also cover the second one. So we have aggregated Kube API servers and then Open API v3. And here is the link for the session. I don't know if this is open. Maybe if you're a virtual attender, you can also look at it, but then it will be public. So just wanted to advertise it.
Do we want to add the API parity and fairness borrowing into that? It's kind of a big change we might want to socialize.
You mean into the talk? It seems to be a little bit late, right?
I'm asking.
The topic's already set and we had to prep the presentations. So
all right, that answers that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. Looks like we're going to end on time for once.
Thank you, Daniel, for the topics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.